Just a little disclaimer. None of the footage that isn't of me is not mine. So all the credit is going to be linked down in the description. Most of it, if not all of it, is from Martin Walls himself. So his channel is going to be linked down there. I also recommend watching his videos before coming back to this one, because then it won't make sense if you don't. Also, heavy spoilers. If you don't want it spoiled for you, go and watch them and then come back here. Enjoy. Now, what is the most disturbing piece of media you've ever seen? Was it lost episodes? Creepypastas? YouTube creepy videos from like 2008? For me, it's the Walten Files. Easily the most disturbing, horrific, mind-bending horror series I've ever seen. It tops every Hollywood horror movie for me. Easily. It beats all of the creepypastas I've seen. It beats all of that. Because the visuals, the audio, the situations that these victims are in, and then trying to sympathize with them or put yourself in, well, myself, I guess. I would put myself into their shoes. And it would make me physically nauseous because of how twisted it is. It's wild. Also, little side note, don't mind the lighting and the clothing changes. There's a lot of stuff that was real bad or real cringe, so I'm just going over and redoing it. Yeah, I know it's a little bit shocking to the eyes, but it's got to be done. So episode 1, we're introduced to the company of Bunny Smiles Incorporated. We're introduced to the showstoppers, which are just like the 4 main animatronics of the series. But it's also weirdly vague, leaving a lot to your imagination, which is fantastic. Mwah. Love it. Then there's this scene, which honestly destroyed me mentally because of how, not terrifying, not scary, but just simply how uneasy and dreadful it is. Just, you have to see it for yourself. It's creepy. There's just something so unsettling about it. It's mostly the sound, but also the fact that Bon is just so unbothered by it. Why is that in such an innocent-seeming clip? You know, just a little show about Bon trying to have a sleepover with his friends, and then the TV glitches out in the middle of the night showing a missing person in real life and not even in the cartoon lore. It doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense. What was that groaning? Was that him? Was it someone trying to get somebody else's attention on his behalf? Why is it glitching? Why is it even showing up on the TV in the first place? None of it makes sense. And it's mostly the audio for me that absolutely drives this primal fear in me to try and understand what it is, but also to get away. I had to watch this scene in broad daylight because I was too scared to watch it alone and or in the dark. I'm kind of unbothered by it now because I've seen it so much, but the first time I watched it, I had to pause and take a moment to look at my surroundings to make sure I wasn't in danger. That is how unsettling that clip was for me the very first time I saw it. So in the end of that episode, we see Brian Stells, one of the facility caretakers for the bunker that's used for storage while the company relocates, which is a little bit of a jump, especially for the first episode, but we see him get absolutely mauled. And it just goes to show a little bit of what Bon is capable of as a sentient, possessed animatronic. We don't know yet. So now let's jump to episode 2. This is where things really take off. So towards the beginning of the video, we get introduced to the relocation project, which will make sense later on. But one of the plans for this relocation project is to add features to the animatronics, such as blinking. So we get a little sequence talking about the new features and what features were there before and how they should work. And then things get a little bit sinister. The screen behind Banny goes dark. And as she's looking around for friends, her eyes are just darting back and forth and back and forth. we start to see stills and fade-ins and fade-outs of a human face on top of Banny's. And it's chilling. So then we get to the rabbit is starving. And quite frankly, it's unsettling to think about, because the whole sequence shows a rabbit trying to get out of a room, but in episode 3, we find out that it's Susan Woodings who got mauled in the same fashion as Brian, paralyzed, and stuffed into Banny. The rabbit is not trying to get out of the building. It's representative, symbolic, of Susan Woodings trying to get out of Banny because she's alive and she's dying of starvation. Tell me that isn't nightmare fuel. Tell me that that position, putting yourself in her shoes, isn't one of the most psychologically tormenting things you've ever thought about. That's what's so great about the Walten Files, is the psychological aspect. It's not necessarily the audio and visuals, but those help. It's putting yourself in their shoes, their torment, their agony. That's the scariest part about the Walten Files, and that is why this was done so perfectly, and it's so invigorating and morbidly curious. I've never seen trauma or agony or horror portrayed in this way, and that's what makes it so good to me. And now I want to talk about Boozoo, or Charles in this case. What I found out afterwards, like long after I watched the series about a year ago, almost 2 years ago, and Charles had one of the most gruesome deaths, I think, in the whole series. So we know that Brian and Susan got absolutely eviscerated, right? But they were alive, which is creepy enough. Also, if you think about it, if you've seen the pictures of them, their bodies, the eyes are always gone. I'll talk about that later. But Charles had his lips ripped off and his eyes taken out, and his whole face was so distorted he couldn't remember his own face. And we see that in Bunnyfarm. You see a lot of stuff in Bunnyfarm. It's kind of a given at this point. He got his lips ripped off. I didn't know that until somebody commented that on one of the videos. It just gets worse. It gets worse. Now, I just remembered, I haven't mentioned Ashley, aka Billy. We see her in episode 2, and she shares pretty much the same fate. She ends up finding a cassette, putting it inside Billy because he's got a cassette player in it. She finds Bon. Bon kills her, stuffs her in Billy. Don't really know the significance of her, but it might come up later. But back to Charles. We see a picture of a distorted version of the mugshot that he had, and it says, "I don't remember my face." That's psychologically torturous in itself. Imagine not being able to remember your face because a robot destroyed it, right? And then that's not even mentioning, that's not even touching on his death sequence, I guess, his death. Now, going back to the whole eyes are gone out of the corpses thing, just simply put, there's a lot of like lore that kind of explains it, but in a nutshell, the eyes, the eyeballs, are what are used for the animatronics. The eyes are put into the eye sockets instead of like mechanical eyes. Think about that. Human corpse eyes inside of an animatronic's eye sockets. And in one of the videos, I can't remember which one it is, but in one of the videos, it explains to keep the eye sockets clean. Why? Because of the human eyes in the eye sockets. Oh my god, dude. But anyway, back to it. We see a black and white picture of eyes, and creepy music starts to play. To me, it sounds like taps. I don't know the exact song, but it sounds like taps. And then his face fades in, and it's extremely distorted. You see his teeth, but not really any lips. His lips got ripped off. I'm not going to mention it again, because it's so horrific. And then it cuts to a shot of an eyeless and mouthless Boozoo covered in blood, heavily breathing. That's already unsettling, but then it cuts to another version of him shooting towards the screen, and it starts playing. I think, looking back now, that disturbed me the absolute most out of everything that I had seen up until that point. That missing, it messed me up for days. I almost couldn't sleep. And I'm a horror veteran. I've seen a lot of terrifying movies that don't even scratch the surface of what the Walten Files made me feel. Now, I think what's creepiest about that scene is the fact that it says missing, missing, missing with a, just a gruesome face. But it's mocking the fact that he's missing. He's mocking the fact that everybody thinks he's just disappeared. He's mocking them because he's like, I've been here in front of you the whole time, and you're only thinking that I disappeared. Well, here I am, in the flesh, right here in front of you. That's what's creepy about it. That's why it messes me up. He's mocking it. God, that just goes to show anger, anguish, and everything in between. It's so good. And then we get to Sha, or Rosemary, Sophie's mother. Her story is deeply, deeply traumatic and creepy. So she ends up going back to Bond's Burgers after Jack went missing to look for him, hoping he would be there somewhere. Well, instead, she found a rabbit. But that's just the shortened version. She ends up going into Bond's Burgers after closing about 2 in the morning. Nobody's there but her. She hears a voice that says, "I know where he is, Rosie." Meanwhile, the game that Sophie's playing, the minigame for Sha, is hide and seek. As if you think it couldn't get creepier, it does. So she goes back there to find a rabbit, Bond. And he dismembers her limb by limb and shoves her into Sha. At this point, there's no surviving that. She's dead. However, she's undead. She's a ghost. She's a zombie. Whatever. It's weird. She's still alive in a sense. Because in hide and seek, when Sophie finally hides and Sha finds her, she goes,
"Am I still beautiful to you, Sophie?"
And then it says, "Found you," and then it cuts real quick to a dark hallway, and you can see blood coming up the wall. And then it shows a censored, distorted image of Rosemary in a cartoon Sha, and you can hear Rosemary's screams, clipping the mic because of how loud they are, right? The reason that they shut Bond's Burgers down was because people were complaining that they could hear a woman screaming and live music from Bond's Burgers at 2 in the morning. And really quick, if you think about it, going back to episode 2, it talks about how when she woke up, it felt like her entire body was bleeding out. That's hell. She had a relatively quick and easy death, but now she's back in the animatronic for eternity. That is hell. She does not deserve that. But anyway, I had to put that in there because it makes it even worse. These people heard Rosemary's death, and nothing happened except for it becoming condemned and abandoned. And then the Relocate Project. That's dark. That's so dark. No horror movie has ever touched on a subject like that I have seen. I've seen gore. I've seen shocking stuff, but this is like dark and disturbing, and it makes you uneasy because you think it would never happen to you. But these people probably thought the same thing, and look what happened to them. absolutely dark. And finally, at the end of Bunnyfarm, we get to see what happened to start all of this. The whole catalyst for the entire chain of events and deaths that happened over the course of the series is this right here. There's a phone call. It's Jack Walten asking Felix Kranken if he can do just a small favor for him. Rosie is taking Sophie to the dentist. Jack has to work. Ergo, he's asking Felix to take Ed and Molly, the two youngest children, to the school party because nobody else can take them. Well, Felix is drunk, right? Just to put it simply, he's drunk. He's been an alcoholic for quite some time, and because of this, he's destroying his life. He destroyed his marriage. His wife, Linda, now ex-wife, left him, so he drank even more. So for some reason, he agrees to take the kids to the party, and all goes well. But Jack wanted them gone and home by 9 o'clock. It's now 9:37. The kids are out looking for Felix. And guess where they find him? The drinking zone. And because this is the 70s, they had alcohol at the school for some reason. Would never fly today. Well, they asked if he was drinking. He lies. He says he's just feeling a little dizzy and he's tired. Well, he keeps repeating that same thing the whole drive home. But he's tipsy enough that he ends up getting in an accident. And then we find out that Ed and Molly died on impact. So in his drunken stupor and his panicked state, he doesn't tell anybody. He just buries them, leaves the toy that he built for them on their graves, and leaves. And he goes home to drink some more. Jack tried calling him 26 times, asking,
"What happened to my children? What the hell is wrong with you? If anything happened, Felix, you must tell me."
But Felix doesn't want to talk to him. He can't do that to him. The screams of regret, shame, guilt are haunting, to say the least. Haunting. Because you hear Felix, all of those emotions swirling through his head. You hear it, and you can imagine what it would be like to be him in that situation. It's so mentally damaging to think about accidentally killing kids that you called your niece and nephew. Regardless of actual relation, he was like an uncle to them, and he was their killer. I'm just gonna let that sink in. I don't even think I could say anything else about it. Whatever you're thinking right now is what has been said and what can be said. So all this to say that Martin Walls did an absolutely amazing job at telling a story of broken, lost, damaged people and how they die. He did such an incredible job at portraying horror, trauma, guilt, regret, agony, torture. I've never seen anything better, and I will be hard-pressed to find anything better. From here on out, I will proudly proclaim this series as the best horror series ever made. Whether you agree with that or not is up to you, but that's my stance on it. I know I kind of went over the entire series and said very little about it, but it's more left to you how you feel about it, what your thoughts are. I'm just giving a little bit of perspective on somebody who was deeply affected by this story. It messed me up. I'm still messed up from it. Every time I think about it, it gives me chills because I think, what would it be like to be them? What would it be like to get mauled? What would it be like to be the reason that your best friend's kids are dead? It's haunting. That's the best way I can describe it. It's haunting. The Walten Files is genius. And if anything can ever beat it, it will be simply a masterpiece. Because that's what this is. The Walten Files is a masterpiece in storytelling, art style. It's completely unique. It's refreshing to see that horror is not only not dead, but it can still be very impactful. It's almost endless what horror can create and what horror can appeal to and what horror can show you that you haven't experienced and probably will never experience. But it does a good job at showing the darkest of life, the darkest of death. And Martin Walls did that in the best way I think it could ever be done, because it's vague enough to leave you thinking, but it tells a coherent story. That's about all I can say about it. So, if you made it this far, thank you for watching. I very much appreciate it. I love talking about horror and stories and the psychology of it and kind of how it affects people. So I will probably be doing more of these if I can find anything as good as the Walten Files or better. But I would love to keep making more. But that's pretty much it for me. And just remember, infuse a little bit of horror into your life every day, and you might learn something.